All right, grade 10s, let's look at anti-globalism. So this year we've been looking at globalization, and to go all the way back to the first unit of the year, we defined globalization as the interconnectedness of mankind. We looked at globalization and suggested that there's many dimensions of globalization. Globalization is happening economically, it's happening politically, it's happening culturally and socially. That you can see it expressed linguistically. That globalization seems to be this force, this unavoidable, inevitable wave that is transforming mankind. But at the same time, we're at the point of the course now where to explore the idea of anti-globalism. So far, we have looked at some case studies that may give you some insight into why people might be upset with globalization. So economically, why might there be some anti-globalism? So within that dimension of globalization, within that facet of interconnectedness of mankind, have we seen anything economically where you're like, yeah, that's why people don't like globalization? Yes?
Sometimes globalization can lead to local businesses shutting down because of bigger companies that are better.
Yeah, so who might feel anti-globalization? Well, people who want to grow or support local business. So anti-globalization may have as one aspect of it, one arm of it, might be people who want to shop and have a local business. So both local consumers and local businesses may be anti-global, because once they interconnect with the global network, then we lose that uniqueness as we end up becoming homogenized, right? So people who value that local community, that uniqueness of it, or even entrepreneurs within that local community might be anti-global because now their little mom and dad shop cannot compete with the larger businesses. So small business owners, small local business owners might feel anti-globalization. Local consumers. Any other reasons for economically for anti-globalism? So local business owners, small business owners, people who value small communities, unique communities. They don't want to see homogenized communities. People who want to consume locally. Anything else that would say, yeah, you know what, economically, that's why I don't like globalization. Yes?
They might favoritize like the rich countries and the profit.
Yeah, so a lot of people look at the forces of globalization, the legacy of Bretton Woods, so the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and they see them all as instruments of the wealthy countries. So another reason to be anti-global is that we associate globalism with a movement that is helping the rich countries more than the poor countries. And we saw that in Bolivia with the water war, that Cochabamba, Bolivia needed to privatize water, and that ended up helping Bechtel, ended up helping the United States, corporation of transnationals from the US. So people might economically be opposed to globalization because they associate globalization with an agenda that is pushing the wealthy to become wealthier. It's increasing disparity. It's increasing that gap. It's only further impoverishing. It's neo-imperialism. They might say, well, I don't like globalization because it's just another round of imperialism. That in the 19th century, at least empires, they were a little more transparent about it. They'd come and plant their flag. But here in the 20th century and now the 21st century, anti-globalists might say that, you know, we're being shady, we're being manipulated by globalists to believe that it's in our best interest to invite them into our countries, but then they just do the same thing. They colonize us. So another reason for anti-globalism economically is because it seems to favor the rich, the wealthy countries, the United States, the G8, the G7, the G20. We haven't seen that the world is flat. We see that through the WTO and the IMF, the World Bank and GATT, and all these other legacies of Bretton Woods, we see that the world has been designed to favor the rich. So that's another reason economically. Anything else economically that you'd be like, man, this is why globalization sucks. Sucks because it has led to what? Because of economic globalization? Yes.
Over-exploitation.
Exploitation, right? We see exploitation, extreme exploitation in sweatshops. We see extreme exploitation. We see more slaves today than at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. And what has made that possible? Globalization, economic globalization. So when we interconnect economically, it has led to, as you said, over-exploitation. That it's an extreme version or perversion even of greed that has led to man seeing benefit in the misery of others. That when I see that I can gain from your misery, there's something wrong with my mindset. You know who thinks that? That I can gain from your misery? A predator thinks that. A psychopath thinks that. And that's what we're seeing, is that globalization is allowing psychopathy to become global. That psychopathy is kind of like a religion, a greed, an exploitive greed, where we prey upon our fellow citizens, our fellow neighbors, for our benefit. That has become a creed, almost like a way of life. Greed is our creed. Man, I just thought of that. Greed is our creed. It could be like a t-shirt, hats. We could like trademark that. We could get rich. Man, it's all we'll need. Any other reasons economically where we hate globalization? Think of the externality. That's a word we've used a lot this year. So what's the externality of economic globalization that might lead to some anti-globalists? When we think of externality of globalization, we often think of the impact that our economic lives have on the environment, the biosphere, right? I love the word biosphere because it makes me think of this thin little section of livable life space in the known universe. So we have the ecological contamination of the very fragile biosphere as an externality of our economic globalized lives. So why might they be anti-global? Because the ecological damage that economic globalization has created. That's our ecological footprint, right? That's the lack of sustainable development. That's the need for a paradigm shift. So what are these people wanting? They're wanting that paradigm shift. They even have arrows. They even have arrows saying, like, we're going in this direction, we should be going in this direction. So anti-globalists, they're looking for a paradigm shift away from individualism, away from greed, and towards collectivism, towards some kind of future that is sustainable. And we could unpack that whole toxification of the biosphere, the death of birth. There's that whole mini unit on sustainability in the environment that fits into this part of the equation of why people are anti-global. They're anti-global because they're saying because of globalization, we're destroying the biosphere. So we have the economic reasons, we have the environmental reasons. Within this source, there's a nuance that makes us think of political reasons, and that nuance is within the science of democracy. WTO, an instrument of globalization, is heading in this direction. Democracy would be the opposite direction. So we can infer that the source is suggesting that as a result of globalization, we're losing democracy. We're moving away from democracy. So if we embrace the WTO, if we embrace the World Bank, if we embrace the IMF, what we're not embracing is democracy. How does that make sense? Well, what is democracy at its root? I said it earlier today, it means the government upholds the will of the people. The will of the people, that's democracy. That the government is accountable to the people. That the government is legitimate because they're doing what the people want the government to do. In Bolivia, in Cochabamba, before they reversed their decision, we saw that the municipal government in Cochabamba and the federal government of Bolivia, they were not upholding the will of the people, they were upholding the will of Bechtel. And when they were upholding the will of Bechtel, under the direction of the IMF and the World Bank, what globalization was doing was pulling the government away from the people. The people want you to protect them because water is too expensive. The people want you to nationalize water again because privatized water is too expensive. But the government said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to actually deploy the troops. We're going to bring out the riot police, and we're going to break up your protest because Bechtel owns the water, even that which comes from the sky in Cochabamba, Bolivia. So when they were doing that, at the same time as this, no doubt, this comes from 1999, the water war was at the turn of that century as well. That's what these people are thinking about, is that the instruments of globalization, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, it's pulling governments away from the people they're supposed to represent. Because now they have a decision. Am I here as a pawn of transnationals or as a pawn of the people who elected me? Well, in Bolivia, at least in the beginning, we saw the government say, no, you know what? I'm going to do what they want. Now, you've studied NATO a little bit, you've studied NAFTA a little bit, you've studied the EU a little bit. Grade 10 isn't the first time you've heard of these organizations that Canada is part of. And you may remember that when Canada jumps into trade blocs like NAFTA and now the USMCA, what we have done is we've given up some sovereignty. Remember, if there's a disruption in our natural gas and we have a contract to supply X number of cubic billion tons of natural gas to the Americans, if some of our natural gas plants are disrupted, then we might have to give them the stuff that's actually been reserved for our own domestic consumption. So when our government enters into trade agreements that end up, as a consequence, violating our own sovereignty, that's an example of this. So when in Canada we enter into trade agreements that, as a consequence of those trade agreements, if we cannot supply the Americans the contract that we have to give them up our domestic supply too. So Canadians freeze in their homes in the wintertime because we don't have enough natural gas, so that they have enough natural gas in the United States. We're putting other people's interests ahead of ours. That's what's happening here. Now, as we look further to this very specific source, they're in Seattle. It's 1999. There's the Battle of Seattle that you may or probably may not know of. But before we get to the actual Battle of Seattle, then one of the last nuance that you may unpack is this little sign here, Rainforest Action Network. And you may be wondering, well, what's that? You know, they have very little things going on in this sign. It's democracy and WTO, and then they have their logo. So one thing that you may have to do is say, okay, well, who are these people? We can infer from their name alone that they're an environmentalist group, right? Rainforest Action Network. So it's a non-governmental organization that is a grassroots, meaning that, you know, its foundation is at the grassroots level, meaning it starts with the people. And what they're trying to do is transform the way that we interact with each other. We want to transform our impact on the Amazon, onto the rainforest. We want to have more sustainable lives. So what are they protesting in this sign? They're saying that because of the WTO, we're not actually living sustainable lives, and they're doing that because it benefits transnationals. And they're suggesting that the will of the people is that we have more sustainable lives. That the Rainforest Action Network is upholding the will of people more than the government of Seattle, or the government of Washington State, or the government of the United States of America is. So lots going on in this cartoon. You may end up seeing this, this photo. You may end up seeing this photo on the final exam, or in an A1. We have used it on both before. Because it is simple, but it allows you to pull many different nuances in. I'd like to show you a couple of quick videos about this event. Then we'll take our mask break. After the mask break, we'll come back. We'll look at free trade agreements a little bit more. And we'll look at the difference between NAFTA and the USMCA. And we'll look at some more sources about anti-globalism. See if you can unpack that. And we're going to add these two words to our A1 skills today. what is explicitly on the page and what is implicitly on the page. So another way to unpack sources is to look for the explicit and the implicit. So we'll add that. Should be able to get all that done before the lunch break, and then after lunch get into one of my favorite lessons on human rights. So before the mass break, we're going to take a quick dive into the battle for Seattle. Some of the videos have some vulgar language in them. I think I picked the ones that don't. I may be wrong. So it is a protest. There's going to be people angry, and sometimes they use swear words when they're angry. You're going to remember her from the video of the corporation. She's the one that came up with the slogan, "The Death of Birth," when she's talking about the Terminator technology in the seed that Monsanto has created. Hopefully you're making those links now in the course. It's been a long time since I taught Social 10. You know, that break, the emergency ed, was a long time. When I'm making those links, I'm expecting that you're also making those links, because this curriculum is newish to me again as well. So let's take a look at the battle for Seattle, and we're going to have 2 quick videos before the mass break.
Seattle is part of the the International Forum on Globalization, which brought together all of us who were questioning GATT, which was the precursor of the WTO before the Marrakesh Agreement was signed. I was fighting GATT because it's the corporations who mentioned GATT first in a meeting in 1987 in Geneva and in a resort outside Geneva. And they were talking about patenting seeds and life. They were talking about an international treaty which would make it a requirement for all countries to patent seeds and would make it illegal for farmers to save seeds. And that this free trade agreement is what they were going to work on, and they talked about 5 corporations controlling food and health by the year 2000.
So, to summarize her argument, she's anti-globalist because she's anti-corporation control over seed technology. She's pro-farmer, right? She's on the side of farmers. She wants farmers to be able to save seed from year to year. And she fears that in the future, in her future, because she's speaking in 1999, in the future, corporations would control the food of the world, that they would control the seeds. And since 2000, we've seen corporations be able to, through the Human Genome Project and genetics of seeds and stuff like that, patent life. And we saw that in the documentary The Corporation. It's nice that there's the Coliseum behind her.
That conversation of 87 started me on the path of saving seeds, working with my government to not allow patenting of seeds, working with our ambassadors to not allow trips to be designed like Monsanto had designed it, where they said we were the patient, diagnostician, and physician all in one. But because I come from India, to colonize the country, East India Company was created. The first free trade agreement was not NAFTA or WTO. The first free trade agreement was imposed on India by the East India Company, 716. So we were very familiar with the use of so-called free trade for corporate rule. And having become free after famines killed 60 million people, we didn't want to be recolonized again.
So she's associating globalization with another round of colonization. She's saying that this is just another way for not the British Empire to control India, but the same interests that were at the head of the British Empire. You know, the corporations, the oligarchs, the wealthy, the rich. And she's shaking you right now because the game has changed. Now it's not corporations controlling India, it's the rich controlling the poor. It's the 1% controlling the 99%. The top 1%, remember the top 1% of people make about 7 million a year in America, and even that's absurd. But when you go down to the top 0.1%, then you have these wealthy billionaires that own 30% of America, whose interests, whether it's the Republicans or Democrats that win the election, the 1% wins the election. Look at Biden, look at Trump. They're very similar. They're old, rich white guys.
And I'm so happy that for that period, our former Prime Minister, our former GATT ambassador joined us as the People's Campaign Against WTO, and we passed laws in that window that defended the sovereignty of the seed, the sovereignty of farmers. But as the corporate rule continued, the monopoly on seeds continued, we've lost 400,000 farmers to suicide because of debt. Permanently, 1 billion people are hungry. And when you introduce the protests going on in Chile and Colombia and other parts of the world, I actually see the process of today in every part of the world as a continuation of the fight against neoliberalism, a fight against austerity, a fight against the permanence of structural adjustment, which is what free trade is about. It has given us the control of 4 giants, poison cartel, over our seed and our food. It's given us the billionaires. Bill Gates is a child of WTO. He got rules written so he wouldn't have to pay taxes in trans-border transfer, which is why software was outsourced to India. Jeff Bezos, shipping goods around, paying no taxes anywhere. These trillion...
Dude, she's in 1999 talking about Amazon. She's a prophet. Amazon wasn't much of a corporation in 1999.
Billionaires are children of the WTO rules, and even then we said our world is not for sale. We said we are writing other rules. Movements have written other rules. Another world is possible. We are making it, but the brutality and limitless greed of the handful of corporations and billionaires is now really reaching ecocidal and genocidal limits.
I'm not even sure we need to watch the next one. I think she captured it right there. The anti-global and the protest at Seattle in 1999. Let's go outside for a mask break. It's a beautiful day. I'd say go outside. It's a nice day.